Howdy folks, and welcome back to the Valentine's Day visit to the Bovington Tank Museum. In this final part of the video, I wanted to focus on the one section of the museum that I never really got to look at when I came here for Tank Fest last year in 2013. But before we get started, as we braved the horrible weather outside on the way from the Vehicle Conservation Centre to the display hall, we noticed something interesting in an abandoned lot outside. Roughly halfway between the Vehicle Conservation Centre and the main museum display halls, we found this Mark I Churchill with the original turret, the howitzer mounted in the hull. The Churchill's standing guard over this fenced-in lot, and it's a testament to the number of vehicles that they actually have here at the Tank Museum, that they don't have space to keep everything indoors. So it seems that the machines they have the best chance of preserving are kept indoors. The machines they either have a surplus of, or which are in the worst condition, are left outside in lots like this. And there are a couple of gems hidden away here. If you have a look at the back there, there's a couple of Russian tanks. And that's a Churchill gun carrier. Never seen one in the flesh, minus the gun of course. Unfortunately, a crime against tanks is being committed here. And I just noticed it, right next to the Churchill gun carrier, somebody has left a Centurion to rot away in the rain. We need to find the person responsible and have them shot. Anyway, let's get back indoors. It's awfully wet and cold out here.
Top secret footage of brand new Soviet Tier 1 light tank. Very strong. Hull made of hardened Stalin wood. 100mm gun. Best tank in the game.
Anyway, back inside the museum, and since it is Valentine's Day, here's a Valentine tank that most of you are probably unfamiliar with. This is the Mark IX, turret modified to take the 6-pounder gun. Those of you who know and love the Valentine from World of Tanks, well, as you can see there, the thickness of the frontal armour around the driver's hatch there. The Valentine Mark IX was actually a lot more mobile than the Valentine III that you may know from World of Tanks. This thing actually had a, wait for it, 165 horsepower engine. The Valentine also had the distinction of being the first tank ever built in Canada. Behind the Valentine, another tank that those of you who play World of Tanks will be intimately familiar with, the British Crusader light tank. Mark III version here, as you can see, fitted with the 6-pounder gun, the first British tank to ever be fitted with that gun. Mark III Crusaders were also fitted out as command tanks with a turret fixed in place and a dummy gun fitted in place of the 6-pounder. And also equipped with 40mm anti-aircraft guns to work as mobile anti-aircraft platforms. Tucked away in a corner of the museum here, we've got the British 75mm quick-firing gun. Much like the 75mm Eb3 gun on the Lee and the Sherman, it had a very effective high-explosive shell, unlike the guns that it replaced, the 2-pounder and the 6-pounder, which were really only good for dealing with armoured targets like other tanks. This gun was used most famously on tanks like the Cromwell and the Churchill. Speaking of guns, here we see the beautiful Ed Francis modelling the 380mm rocket launcher barrel of the Sturm Tiger. Look at the size of that monster. Yes, Ed. Big bada boom. Now, this thing, certainly from the rear, you could be forgiven at first glance for thinking it was some kind of German Marder variant. It does kind of bear a close resemblance to it, but obviously the British unit badge on the side and the Canadian badge on the rear are a bit of a giveaway that it is in fact a British Commonwealth design. This is in fact the Valentine Archer with the 17-pounder gun. Now you might be looking at this and thinking, well, congratulations Jingles on finally successfully identifying a 17-pounder gun, but that doesn't look like the front of any Valentine I've ever seen, and you'd be entirely correct because in the Valentine Archer the gun faced to the rear. Speaking of tank destroyers, despite the huge collection of logs on the side of the fighting compartment, this is not a captured Stug pressed into Russian service. This is in fact one of the 30 Stugs that were bought by Finland from Germany in 1943, and a further 29 in 1944, and were used against the Russians in the Continuation War, where they accounted for over 80 enemy vehicles for the loss of only 8 of their own. Finnish modifications to the Stugs that they received from Germany were primarily, or most obviously, the 3 extra logs strapped to either side of the fighting compartment, and less obviously, the entire front of the hull around the gun mantlet is reinforced with concrete. course, the Finns couldn't afford to be choosy in the continuation war against Russia. They would quite happily use anything they could get their hands on against them, including captured Russian tanks, like this T-26 model 1933, armed with one 45mm gun and one 7.62mm DT machine gun. Speaking of the Soviets, the Su-76 here, the second most widely produced Soviet vehicle of World War II, second only to the T-34. Over 14,000 of these things were built. Based on the chassis of a lengthened T-70 light tank, it had a very effective 76mm gun, which was entirely capable of dealing with any German light or medium tank at the time. It could even take out a Panther with a flank shot. Almost completely ineffective against the Tiger, however. Russian tank crews, noted for their sense of humour, referred to it as the bare-arsed Ferdinand. Next to the Su-76, you can see the mighty KV-1, named after the Soviet Defence Minister Klement Voroshilov, and yes, the Finns captured these and used them against the Russians too. It's currently being cleaned up by some of the Friends of the Tank Museum, volunteer group who work here at Bovington. What we've got here, from the rear it looks like an M3 Lee or a Ram 2 tank, and you wouldn't be far wrong. It's actually a Ram 2 tank with a turret removed. It's known as the Ram Kangaroo. It's an armoured personnel carrier, and it was the brainchild of Lieutenant General Guy Granville Simons, commander of the Canadian 2nd Corps during World War II, and widely regarded as the finest corps commander, certainly of the Western Allies, during the entire war. Lieutenant General Simons' idea of converting Ram 2 tanks into armoured personnel carriers caught on, and the idea even extended to Shermans and Churchills. Of course, while we're looking at Commonwealth designs and modifications, it would only be fair to take a look at this thing, the Australian cruiser tank, the Sentinel. Only 65 of these were built. They were never used in combat, and like the Canadian Ram tank, it was based on the drivetrain, lower hull and chassis of the American M3 Lee. Australia designed the Sentinel to be used with the 6-pounder gun. Australia didn't have any 6-pounder guns, and so unfortunately the Sentinel was equipped with the inferior 2-pounder. Now, before we move on to the main display hall, there were a couple of vehicles that people had specifically asked that we take closer looks at. This was one of them, the Tortoise Tank Destroyer, or to give it its full name, the Tank Heavy Assault A39 Tortoise. This is the only Tortoise in the world that still exists in full working order, and I really do mean full working order. This thing was overhauled in 2011 and is capable of moving under its own power, which it did for the first time since the 1950s at Tankfest 2011. There is one other Tortoise of the only 6 prototypes that were ever made that exists at Kirkcudbright in Scotland. Unfortunately, it's without its gun, and it's just a rusting hulk. Another slightly less famous British tank destroyer is this thing here, to give it its full name, the FV4101 Cromwell Heavy Anti-Tank Gun, and it is a tank destroyer, like the Hellcat, like the M10 Wolverine, not a tank. It actually uses the 20-pounder gun, same gun that you find on the Centurion. Now, in order to fit a gun that big onto something like a Cromwell, they had to completely redesign the turret, which meant that the turret was a lot bigger, a lot easier to hit, and had a lot less armour than the already thinly armoured Cromwell. Charioteers did actually see combat, although not in World War II. They were designed in the 1950s and used in 1978 by the Palestine Liberation Organization in the southern Lebanon conflict against the Israelis. Since we're looking at tank destroyers, there's a couple further down that deserve a closer look. The first is the famous Swedish Stridsvagn 103, or the S-Tank, although if you call this a tank destroyer, the Swedes get very, very upset. They insist it's a tank. Now, behind the S-Tank is something that I had never seen before. This is the British contentious air-portable tank destroyer. This version fitted with the 105mm L7A1 gun, but this gun has an auto-loading mechanism. The Contentious was designed to function with a crew of 2. Now, like the S-Tank, upon which the design is based, the gun couldn't actually move up or down, at no elevation, no depression, and in order to actually raise and lower the gun, the hydraulic suspension would be used to tilt the entire tank backwards and forwards. Unlike the S-Tank, which is fully enclosed, the Contentious was designed to be open-topped, although this is just a prototype and isn't what the final version was going to look like. But with no chemical or biological protection for the crew, this was never designed to face the Red Army directly in the Cold War, but it was designed to kill the T-54s that the Soviet Union was exporting to all of its client states, and which could be used to threaten the last outposts of the British Empire, hence the need for an air-portable tank destroyer. This is the Stridsvagn 104. It's this Swedish modification of the Mark III Centurion, although by the time the Swedes had finished modifying that thing, it bore about as much resemblance to a Mark III Centurion as a Tiger does to an M1 Abrams. And this is another Swedish tank. It's the IKV-91. Well, it's not actually a tank. Technically, it's a tank destroyer mounting a 90mm gun, fully amphibious. Actually uses its fuel tanks as part of the armor protection, despite not having particularly thick armor by battle tank standards. There were 2 layers of armor along the sides, with the diesel fuel stored in between the 2 armor sections, with the inner armor being the thickest. This arrangement of armor, fuel, and armor meant that it was actually pretty well protected against high explosive anti-tank ammunition. This is a Leopard C2, which is apparently what happens when the Canadians take a Leopard 1A5 turret and they put it on a Leopard 1A3 chassis. First the Ram tank, then the Leopard C2. Oh Canada, you do love messing around with other people's tanks, don't you? Next, the earliest version, the Mark I of the Centurion main battle tank. Designed to be able to take a hit and survive from the German 88mm anti-tank gun, the Mark I was armed with a 17-pounder gun and, curiously, in a mounting to the side of the main gun, a 20mm Polston cannon. The Polston 20mm cannon was essentially just a Polish version of the Oerlikon 20mm gun, although the one that you can see here mounted on the Centurion was unusual, in that the magazine was actually of a Czechoslovakian design. And here's Bovington's Panzer IV. It's actually a bit of a Frankenstein version of the Panzer IV. It was originally a Panzer IV-D, but it's been modernised to Panzer IV-G standards. You can see the extra armour bolted onto the front of the hull to increase the frontal armour to 80mm, and of course it has the L43 75mm gun. Of course, if there's one thing Bovington has, it's lots and lots of Panzers. Panzer III there, and right next to it, the mighty, mighty Tiger. If you get in close, you can actually see the battle damage that disabled this Tiger. It was hit right there by a Churchill, which jammed the gun mantlet, forced the crew to abandon the tank. That has got to be the luckiest Churchill crew ever. That gun must have been pointing right at them. Bovington's Tiger is of course in full working order. I was lucky enough to see this thing being put through its paces in the arena at Tankfest 2013. I don't know what it is about the Tiger. There's just something about this tank. From one extreme to the other, this is the Carden-Lloyd tankette. And Dave Lister here absolutely loves this little machine. He's written numerous articles about it, in particular for Wargaming's World of Tanks website. Next there's a couple of Vickers-Armstrong designs, starting here with the Vickers Medium Mark I, a tank that really wasn't very good at all, but it did have one outstanding feature, a 3-man turret, which meant that the commander was free to actually command the tank, and didn't have to do things like load, aim, fire the gun, operate the radio. This concept was so far ahead of its time that absolutely nobody took any notice of it. And it wasn't until the Germans designed the Panzer III that the idea of allowing the tank commander to just get on with his job and command the tank caught on. Now, this next tank might look very familiar to you, despite the fact that most of you have probably never seen one before. Designed in 1928, this is the Vickers-Armstrong Mark E Type B, a tank that was so successful the British Army decided they didn't want it. But it sold all around the world, and the reason you may be thinking, you know, that looks very, very familiar, is because this thing was built under license in Russia as the T-26, which we saw earlier, captured by the Finnish army and repainted in Finnish colours. The British Army did eventually use these tanks. At the outbreak of the Second World War, all commercial tanks still in their factories were impounded by the government, and these were used for training tank crews. It really is fantastic having so many of these historic vehicles just right next to each other. You've got the French B1, the British Cruiser Mark III tank, Over here, the tiny little light tank Mark 6B and the Mark 6C were the first mass-produced British tank. 1,200 of those things were built. Probably the best German design of the Second World War. The Panzerkampfwagen 5 Panther, Model G, and then a tank that was entirely welded at a time when most tanks were riveted or cast, the Panzer IIF. Inside this display case is the 85mm shell of what is widely regarded as the most successful tank ever built, the Soviet T-34. Over 70,000 T-34s of all makes and models were built during and after the Second World War, and they fought in combat chiefly against that, the German Panther, armed with the deadly KWK-42 75mm gun. This Panther was actually captured incomplete at the factory where it was being built at the end of the Second World War, and construction was completed by the engineers of the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineering Corps. Of course, it wouldn't be a British tank museum if it didn't have a Churchill, and this is actually the last Mark 7 Churchill ever built. It was quite literally driven straight from the factory to the tank museum. It's practically brand new. Here at the back you can see the equipment that turned a Churchill into the Churchill Crocodile, the flamethrower tank, the modification kit that would turn any Mark 7 Churchill into the Crocodile flamethrowing tank. Was so simple that it could be installed in the field by a team of Royal Engineers. Parked right next to the Churchill, and you'll be delighted to hear I actually get it right this time, this is in fact a Sherman Firefly. It's the M4 Sherman, armed with the very successful British 17-pounder anti-tank gun. One of the fastest tanks of the Second World War, powered by the Rolls-Royce Meteor V12 engine, which was developed from the Merlin engine used to power the Spitfire. This is the Cromwell. A 28-ton tank with a 27-litre 600 brake horsepower engine, this thing could shift 51.5 kilometers per hour, no problem. First appearing in 1970, essentially a simplified version of the T-64, is the T-72. This is the T-72M, an incredibly low-profile tank, and they achieved the low profile of this tank by the simple method of getting rid of the loader. The T-72M had an autoloader. This tank has fought in every major war of the last 20 years, is in service with 35 countries, and is the most widely used main battle tank in the world. The next thing that caught my attention was this display showing the relative sizes of some of the guns fitted to the tanks in the display halls. That monster, right in the middle of that display, is the 120mm gun fitted to the Conqueror heavy tank. If the Red Army had ever rolled into Europe during the 1950s, that's what would have been waiting for them. And that is pretty much it for my return visit to the Bovington Tank Museum on Valentine's Day 2014. I hope you've enjoyed the 3 videos. I had a fantastic time going back to Bovington and checking out some of the display halls that I didn't really get a chance to look at when I was here at Tankfest in 2013, as well as paying a return visit to old friends like the TOG II. But I didn't visit the museum alone. I was accompanied by Eddie, Ed and Dave. And Ed and Dave have got a soft spot for a certain tank of their own.
Go on, Listy, give it a kiss. He really likes this tank, man.
I'll have a Matilda hug.
Go on, have a Matilda hug.
I'm not quite that unreserved.
Just make sure you haven't got the smell of that Lee with you. There we go. Oh no! What's that behind you?